Hi, I'm Scott Guthrie, and I run the ASP.NET and Visual Studio Web Development Tools team. And what I'm going to be doing in this episode today, as well as a couple of other episodes that will be coming up in the near future, is showing off our new release of the product, codenamed Whidbey. And specifically, what I'm going to be doing today is talking about some of the new data access features that we're enabling to make building data-driven web UI easier and faster than ever before. So I'm going to go ahead now and basically switch to demo mode and walk you through a couple of the cool common scenarios that are now enabled in Whidbey.
So what I'm going to go ahead and show you now is the latest, one of the more recent builds that we have of Whidbey. This is a build of Visual Studio and a build of ASP.NET that's about a week old for right now, so fairly current. And it's going to show you a little bit of what some of the data access experience is going to be like in building data-driven web UI with the beta that's going to be coming out later this spring. So specifically what I'm going to go ahead and do is build a new page that I'm going to call a data page 1. And I'm just going to walk through building with it a simple kind of data page report that's going to display some data for us. So we're going to call this data demo 1. And we'll just highlight our font a little bit. And what I want to go ahead and do is, within this page, is bind directly against a database and display some data and perform some operations on it. So in Whidbey, we have about 50 new controls in the web space that we're introducing. So we'll have a fairly rich toolbox. One of the things that we've done deliberately to help manage with this toolbox is to make it a little bit more hierarchical in terms of how we've laid out the controls. So for example, you'll see we now have a data section of that toolbox that contains our data controls, and one of the things I'm going to go ahead and do here to get started is just drag and drop one of the new controls that we're releasing, called the grid view, onto the page. Now, once I do that, you're going to see a couple things going on here. On the left-hand side is the control selected. On the right-hand side, you're seeing some new UI that we're introducing in Whidbey that we call Smart Tasks. And what Smart Tasks do is they basically provide a sort of list the common tasks or actions that you take with a specific selected control and help provide some kind of guidance UI to the developer so that they can interact with it. So one of the things I can do here is I can go ahead and say I want to connect to a data source. This is going to bring up a wizard that's going to ask me to start off with what type of data source do I want to go ahead and bind against. So with Whidbey, we support binding against lots of different types of data. Directly against middle-tier business objects, directly against databases, against XML files, site navigation system, etc. And one of the neat things about the architecture is you can actually build your own data sources and have them automatically populated within this wizard. To start off with, I'm just going to go ahead and directly bind against a database. So I'm going to say bind against a database. I can choose a connection string that I want to go ahead and bind against. This is just populated using the connections open in my Server Explorer. We're then going to go ahead and ask you where do you want to store this connection string within your application. So specifically, do I want to hard-code it into my code? Well, we do support that, although we don't recommend it. Or a better mechanism is, do you want to go ahead and store it inside your web.config file within your project? Click Next. It'll automatically go ahead and save it within that web.config file for me. I can then at a later point go ahead and encrypt that setting for a production deployment. Now, once I've configured where I want to go ahead and get the data from, the next thing I have to go ahead and choose is what table within that database do I want to connect to, and what is that data operation that I want to do. So specifically here, I'm just going to go ahead and configure it to bring back a few of the columns from the pubs authors table that's built into SQL Server. Go ahead and click Next. I can go ahead and test this data out, see what the data is going to look like directly as part of this wizard. Yeah, that looks fine to me. And then I'm going to go ahead and click Finish. And what this is going to go ahead and do for me is basically populate the grid with some schema information about what each column looks like, and set up a data source that will automatically bind against it for me and populate it with data at runtime. Last but not least, before I run it, I'm just going to go ahead here and choose to auto-format it, and we're just going to make it look a little bit more attractive. going to hit save, and let's go ahead now and hit run to basically run this website and get back that data, see what it looks like. So you'll see here I ran the page. I now have a grid. It's automatically bound against that pub's authors table database, and it's now displaying all those rows for me. I didn't have to write any code. I didn't have to do anything super complicated in order to enable that. Instead, I was able to just sort of walk through that wizard, and away we go. If I want to make this a little bit richer, one of the things I might want to do is, for example, enable paging and sorting. So if you're an ASP.NET developer today, you know that typically today requires writing probably about 15-20 lines of code in order to enable it. And specifically, you got to make sure you understand which point in the overall page lifecycle that you need to do that. To do the page, to do the sort, to do the repopulate, etc. The nice thing in Whidbey is it's gotten a heck of a lot easier. Instead, I can just go back to the smart tasks, and I'm going to say enable paging and enable sorting. Hit save. Go back to our browser here and hit refresh. And now I have a pageable, sortable data grid. Again, I don't have to write any code in order to enable it. It basically just works straight out of the box. Now, I've got a couple of different authors here. I've got a couple different pages of information. Next thing I want to go ahead and do on this page is provide a little bit more of a filtered mechanism, so that rather than show all the states for this data demo, let's just actually maybe show the states based on like a filtered drop-down list. So just basically enable filtering within our application. So to do that, I'm going to prompt the user to enter a state, and I'm going to go back to my toolbox here, and I'm going to drag and drop standard drop-down list control that we already have in ASP.NET v1.1. Now I could directly bind this drop-down list to data, or in this case here, I'm just going to go ahead and hard code in a few different state values. So we'll put in, let's just put in California, we'll put in Kansas, and we'll put in Utah. So those are some of the values that we have currently in the database. And I'm just going to enable it to be post-backed by default, so when it's changed, we'll revisit the server so that we can bind and update the data. So I've got a drop-down list now here with a couple values. Next step is to go ahead and bind it to the grid so that the grid automatically filters based on what values in that drop-down list. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and configure my data source once again. I want to pull back these columns, but I want to go ahead now and to filter it by the drop-down list, add a where clause as well to my data query. Specifically, I'm going to go ahead and say I want to vary based on the state column, and I want it to equal a value that I'm going to go ahead and pull out of one of a number of different places. So I could write code, for example, to set that column value, or in this case here, you can see I have a declarative way I can go ahead and say I want to bind it against a control value, specifically a value out of the drop-down list 1. Hit OK. I can test this out, so let's see what the California values are going to look like. Yeah, shows me now what California looks like. I hit finish here. I'm just going to bind it one more time. And what you can see now here is I have a grid being displayed. I go ahead and run this now. And now when I change the value to filter by different states, the grid automatically updates it. I still have paging and sorting working. And without having to write any code, in the span of only a couple minutes, I was able to go ahead and build a simple filtered, editable, or filtered, sortable, and pageable grid. So the next thing I want to go ahead and do is enable some editing support. And the way I'm going to go ahead and do this is, rather than enable editing directly onto the page, I want to go ahead and actually enable editing where we're going to do kind of a master detail scenario, where from within this grid I can go ahead and click on a details link for each of these individual rows, go to a separate page which is going to show me all the details on it, and within that I'll eventually also add editing support so that I can go ahead and update it back to the database. So to do that, I'm going to go back to Visual Studio, and I'm going to go ahead and take advantage of another one of these tasks on the grid called Add a New Column. Specifically, I want to add a hyperlink column which is going to let me link to another page. I'm going to have the link for this be called details, and I want to go ahead and pass in as an argument to this link the current author ID of the selected row that we're linking from. And what I'm just going to go ahead and do here is basically say go to a details.aspx page, pass in an argument called author ID, and use the AU_ID column within the database as the argument that we're going to pass in. Hit OK. You'll notice now I have a details column with a bunch of links within my grid. I can then go ahead and build that details page. Within that details page, we'll just call this here author details. So within this details page, I want to go ahead now then and display the author details for the selected author from within that original data grid. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my data toolbox section, and I'm going to add a details view control, which is a new control that we're shipping also as part of WDBI. I'm going to bind this details view also to a database. I'm going to bind it directly against that same connection string that we had before. In this case here, though, I'm going to pull back all the columns from the authors table where the author ID is equal to a value that we're going to declaratively bind, this time against the query string. And that value is going to be called author ID. And I'm just going to go ahead and ask it to generate not only a select statement, but also the necessary update and insert statements that we'll be able to enable editing at a later point as well. So I'm going to go ahead and format this. Hit OK. Now when we go ahead and run our page here, we can select a given state. You'll notice we now have a details link. I can click the details link, and now we jump directly into that author details page with a row that was actually selected as part of that details link. So simple master details now going on between two pages. If I want to enable editing support on this page, I'm going to do basically two things to do it. The first is I'm going to add a link back to that original page so it's easy to navigate back to it. So we're just going to call this return to main data page. So that's just sort of a simple navigation link. To enable editing on this details view then, I'm just going to go ahead and pull up the common tasks for it and select enable editing. Hit save. Now I can go here, let's pull up Eva Carson. We go to the details page here. You'll notice I can click edit. I'm now in editable mode. I'm going to change her to move to, let's say, Kansas. Click update, and now we've updated that row in the database. If I click to return to the main page now, filter on Kansas, you'll see she's been moved to Kansas. Change it back, move back to California, hit update, she's now back there again as well. And so what we've done basically in the last 6 or 7 minutes is built a data-driven page that is filtered by a drop-down list, that enables paging and sorting within a grid, that enables master details against another page, and enables data editing updates against it. Now, I didn't have to write any code, and as you saw, it was fairly easy and fairly seamless to go ahead and take advantage of it. And that's sort of a nice simple demo of how to do common data access scenarios against WDBI. Now, this is great for simple data scenarios, and specifically, it's good for getting data going quick and dirty, and it's good for sort of mocking up some UI. But one of the things that you might be asking yourself is, well, how does this fit into a much broader application enterprise, or an enterprise sophisticated development that you might be doing? How can I neatly kind of componentize my data access logic into a middle tier business component or a web service, bind against it and provide some more flexible functionality on the back-end side. Well, the good news is with ASP.NET WIDBE and Visual Studio, binding against a middle tier object is as easy as I just showed right here in binding directly against a database. And sort of to prove that, we're going to go ahead and build this exact same scenario again, but instead of binding directly against the database, we're going to use a middle tier object layer instead. So let's close down this browser. And let's take a look at the middle tier object we're going to go ahead and bind against. So first of all, I'm going to go ahead and add that middle tier object into my project, specifically within a code directory that you can see displayed right here. There are a couple different classes within this code directory. One is called AuthorsDB, and it's a data access layer implemented using C#. I have a couple methods here that are returning data sets and taking updates of specific columns to update, and I just have some ADO.NET code within that that's basically directly going into the database and updating it. I then have a business access layer that is going ahead and taking advantage of the data access component in order to provide a nice facade or higher level business object model on top of that abstracts out what the data schema looks like and abstracts out the database information. So specifically, I have a class called authors, or author.cs. This is just a standard class with simple constructor as well as standard getter and setter properties for each of the individual properties about the author. This class is not implementing any special interface. It also does not have any special metadata involved here. It's just a standard business class. I then have a separate class called publisher.cs. And this publisher class has three methods that we're going to go ahead and look at. The first is a method called lookup authors by state. It takes a string as an argument, a state value, and it is returning then a collection of authors. So specifically, it's taking advantage of a new feature in WIDBE called generics, and it's declaring a generic list of type author. So it's a strongly bound list collection. Within there, it's just going ahead and then calling the author database component, which is my data access layer, getting back a data set, and then generating that list of author classes or author objects that it then goes ahead and returns. Then I have another method called lookup author details, which also takes a string and returns directly then an author object. And this is again just going against the data access layer. And then I have a method called update author, which is taking an author object directly and then using that to basically update with the data access layer to update the database for that specific author row record that was updated. So three simple methods. What I want to go ahead and do is build now a page which is going to go ahead and go against those three different methods, build that same master detail scenario that we saw before, also enable paging, editing, sorting as part of that master details. But this time, instead of going directly against the database, we're going to bind solely against that middle tier business object and show kind of sort of an enterprise style data access development using WIDBE. So we're going to call this first page here data page 2. In this page, we're going to do the same kind of scenario that we did before. So we're going to call this, though, object binding demo. We'll go ahead and highlight this. Same way that we did before. I'm going to go ahead and prompt the user to enter a state. Like we did before, we're going to go ahead and build a drop-down list. We'll populate it with a few different values. So specifically California, Kansas, and Utah. And then we're going to go ahead and build a grid or drop a grid onto the page, which is going to bind against that middle tier object, and specifically it's going to go ahead then and filter based on the value of that drop-down list. So to do that, we'll go ahead and say I want to connect to a data source. Instead of choosing database, though, we're going to go ahead and select object. What Visual Studio will then do is basically give us, it'll iterate against the objects currently within my project, as well as any assemblies that are added as a reference to my project. And you can see right here it's found that there's 3 business objects, and it's saying which do you want to bind against. we want to bind against that publisher object. I can then go ahead and select for fetching operations or select operations, which method do I want to go ahead and bind against within that middle tier business object. So you'll notice again Visual Studio is reflecting against that. It says, hey, there's two methods you might want to bind against. We're just going to bind against lookup authors by state. It's then going to detect that that method has a couple of parameters. Specifically, right now it has a state parameter. I can either hard code in a value, I could write code to manually populate that value, or in this case here, I'm just going to go ahead and say I want to bind this value against a control, specifically the drop-down list control within that page. Hit OK, and now you can see I have a grid that's been populated against that object. We'll go ahead and format it. Notice that the columns for this grid have automatically been set. What we've done is, as part of the design time experience, is been reflected against that author object. Notice that it had all of these different public properties, created a separate column, a column for each of those properties that we found. Now when I go ahead and run this page, you'll see that we have a grid. It's bound against that data object. And now we have all those different rows that are being returned. I could go ahead here, and just like I could before, I could go ahead and enable paging or sorting. Go back here now, and well, we'll change the page size so that we can actually show that off. If I change the page size down to say let's be 5 instead of 10, one of the things you'll notice here is I have paging working directly on this particular object. I didn't have to implement any special interfaces in order to enable it. Instead, we're able to directly use the collection interfaces in order to provide the paging semantics on top of it. I can also optionally then, if I wanted to do server-side paging, I can go ahead and add a page index property or a parameter as part of that get authors by state method, so that I could go ahead and push the paging semantics back into the database in order to do it even more efficiently back there for large amounts of data. So we now have paging, we now have a filtered grid going against that middle tier object. To enable the master detail scenario, I'm going to do a couple things. One is I'm going to go ahead and select this phone column here and go ahead and remove it. So I'm going to get rid of a few columns, sort of to narrow this down a little bit more. I'm then going to go ahead and add a column just like I did before, which is going to be my details column. We're going to call this details. I'm going to bind, and as part of this hyperlink, I'm going to pass in the ID of the current row to that details page. Again, you'll notice that we're automatically using reflection against the author object to be able to populate this drop-down list for us. And I'm going to go ahead and pass the ID as a parameter to a new author details page that we'll go ahead and build. Hit OK. Next thing I'm then going to go ahead and do is build that author details page. Like so. Within this author details page, we'll just call this author details. Do a couple simple things. I'm going to bind using the details view control just like I did before against this page. I'm going to bind it against that middle tier business object called publisher that we were also using. Specifically, to pull out the author information, I'm going to bind against, in this case, the lookup author details method, which is just going to return a single object. And as the ID property for this particular control, what I want to go ahead and do is I'm going to bind that value against the query string value, which is called ID. I'll go ahead and format this. And now when I go back to my object binding demo, When you notice I have a details link, when I click the details link, it takes us directly to that page where we're actually drilling into the details about that individual record. And away we go. If I want to go ahead and enable editing now on this particular record, I can go back to the author details page. I'm going to go ahead and to enable editing, go back to my database or data source. And I'm going to configure this, in addition to having a select method, to have an update method. And specifically I want to bind it against, to do update operations against the update author method, which is going to take an author as a parameter. Go ahead and click Finish here. And then if I want to enable editing, I can go back and just click this Enable Editing checkbox. This will provide the appropriate UI in order to call that method. And last but not least, I'm just going to provide a simple link so we can go back to that originating page once we've made an update. So now, when I click on a record here, hit refresh, you'll notice we have an edit link. I can go here and change the state. Click Update. It's gone ahead in this data details views talk to my middle tier business object, passing in a new author object with changes. That middle tier object then went ahead and updated the database and reflected the change. And now when I go back to my original page, you'll see that the change for the appropriate user, Cheryl is now inside Kansas, has automatically been updated. So the beauty of all this is that I didn't have to write any code in order to provide this kind of rich middle tier object binding story. I was able to implement a filter drop-down list that basically automatically did filtering against a grid with paging and sorting semantics. I was able to do master details against a separate page in order to drill into those, and I was able to do full editing and updating against those individual rows. And the great thing is, again, I didn't have to write any code in my UI tier in order to enable it. I was able to directly bind against that middle tier business component and just go ahead and build a very simple sort of facade class in order to go ahead and represent my middle tier business object, cleanly separated out from my data access layer, and basically provide kind of the foundation of a fairly clean data access layer within my application. So that was a quick sort of intro to some of the data features that are new into ASP.NET WDB. Hopefully, as you've seen, it's going to go ahead and enable you to build data-driven UI faster and easier than ever before. Do so both directly against databases as well as against rich design patterns using middle-tier object components that enable you to componentize and build enterprise applications.
So hopefully what you've seen today is that building data-driven web UI is easier and faster than ever before with the WDB release that's coming in the near future. You can go ahead and take any ASP.NET data control or data UI control and bind it directly against a database. You can also go ahead and take any ASP.NET control and bind it directly against a middle-tier business object. That's just exposing standard methods with standard collections or arrays that are being returned as results. And the combination allows you to build kind of rich data interaction, handle rich scenarios in an easy way, and enable you to be more successful as developers.